So the topic is on basics of infection control. And in this topic, we'll try to cover different aspects of infection control practices. And we need to understand what is the basic aim of infection control. Why you talk about it and why is it so relevant? Because this is primarily, first of all, to hasten or facilitate the recovery of infections with which most of the patients are admitted to a hospital. Suppose either they are coming with an urinary tract infection or a pneumonia or a wound infections or acute abdomen with some perforation, a surgery has been done. So if there is infection, so we have to facilitate and hasten the recovery from the infective problem with which the patient is already getting admitted to the hospital. And number two and foremost is to prevent further hospital-acquired infections, which is very commonly or popularly known as nosocomial infections. So any patient, whoever is coming to the hospital, the primary aim is to get recovered, to get complete cure. But unfortunately, as we know, in the last 4 to 5 decades, the incidences of hospital-acquired infection is on the rise. And this has actually added woes to the healthcare structure. It increases the length of hospital stay, length of admission, ICU stay, and also definitely has a direct impact on the financial burden, be it in the government setup or in the private sectors. And now nosocomial infections or hospital-acquired infections are also considered one of the most important parameters to judge performance of a hospital. In United States, almost for last 10 years, they actually, when they do an annual grading of the hospitals, they always look at the incidences of nosocomial infections in that particular hospital or the healthcare sectors, based on which they actually grade the hospitals. So, when the patients are getting or choosing any private sector or, the public sector, they are already kind of aware of the incidences of hospital-acquired infections in those particular setups, and accordingly they choose. And so now how we accomplish this infection control practices. It is by constant teaching and training and constant teaching and constant teaching. For this practices to be more streamlined, actually in the last 1 decade, there have been many care bundles have been devised. This is very simple. I would say this concept is very excellent because it has streamlined the processes. It is very easy to comprehend, to teach the new nurses and to have repetitive training and teaching programs based on these care bundles. It can be encompassed in a one paper in the form of some surveillance form or a daily monitoring forms, which can be practiced by the bedside. And so these care modules are mainly meant for the tubes and pipes that are usually inserted in a patient who is admitted in the hospital or in the intensive care unit. Maybe at a nasogastric tube, or it's a endotracheal tube, a central line or a peripheral line, or a urinary catheter, or the different pipes which are maybe surgical drains also. This also includes practices for hospital waste disposal. And infection control audit is also very important to monitor how the practices are being done and to look at the areas of improvisations and the feedback reports. So this is a typical ICU patient who has, you can see there is an endotracheal tube. The patient is attached to a ventilator. There is a dialysis going on, and there is a dialysis line in the groin area which is covered with this blanket. There's a nasogastric tube and other urinary catheter, of course, under the blanket. So these are the common lines that a patient who is admitted to ICU has got with it. So how do we define this? A care bundle is a collection of interventions, usually 3 to 5. So it is not much. It is usually 3 to 5 that are evidence-based and are a means to ensure that the application of all the intervention is consistent for all patients at all times, thereby improving outcomes. So a bundle is like, it just bundle is a few things, if it is sticks or, pens. Similarly, it is care bundle is a collection of interventions. Usually they are in small in number, up to 3 to 5, and they're based on evidences, which is based on the literature. And it need to ensure that application of all these is consistent for all patients at all times, thereby improving outcomes. So what are these bundles? That is urinary catheter bundle, ventilator associated pneumonia, which is shortly called VAP care bundle, CRBSI bundle, that is central line related bloodstream infection bundles, SSI, soft tissue infection preventing bundles, and the smaller ones, which includes the peripheral venous catheter bundles, because thrombophlebitis is also not so uncommon in the when plums are inserted in the limbs, Clostridium difficile care bundle, and sepsis care bundles. So now see, let's look at this urinary catheter bundle. Methods of pre-insertion. First of all, we have to explain the reason that a urinary catheter is being used or going to be inserted to the patient and gain consent. So patient's cooperation is very, very necessary. And we use an insertion checklist to document care or reason for catheterization. That is usually a paper format is there. In areas or hospitals or healthcare setups where there is inconsistent practices, it is best to have an insertion checklist. You know, any new trainee nurse comes or new intern or new staff nurse comes, if you have an insertion checklist like a catheter is required, this betadine bottle is required, this many globes or this gowns are required. If it is there, it is very easy for somebody to just take up that checklist, take it, and then you start. So that ensures uniformity of practices and implementations. And then you have to choose the smallest catheter size for effective drainage. It also minimizes trauma. Use a small sized balloon, that is usually 10 ml for the adults, because if you're excessively inflating the balloon or using oversized balloon, it causes also trauma during inadvertent traction of the urinary catheter. So insertion checklist is the important thing. It makes things very uniform and easy to follow. So how do we catheterize? Do hand hygiene. Hand hygiene is the most important thing. I think it is common to all care bundles, all infection control practices. This is the first and foremost thing, hand hygiene. So procedure should be performed aseptically using sterile gloves, apron, and creating a sterile fluid. The catheter is lubricated with a sterile gel. This is to facilitate easy insertion of the urinary catheter. And the meatus is usually cleaned with sterile saline and betadine solution. So the sterile saline, the small 100 ml saline bottle has to be opened at that point of time, and that saline is used to clean the meatus. To ensure that balloon is inflated in the bladder and not in the urethra. So when you're actually inserting the catheter, you have to make sure that the catheter tip has reached the bladder, and then you have to, how do you know that? Once the catheter reaches the bladder, urine starts coming. If there is adequate amount of urine is collected in the bladder, once urine starts coming, you push it a little bit further and then inflate the balloon to make sure that, you know, the catheter is quite inside and the balloon is not tightly fit at the meter at the entrance point of the bladder and is not causing mucosal injury. So hand hygiene is the most important point emphasized during the insertion bundle. And it has been seen that if the hygiene practices are good during insertion, and if it is sterile practice, precautions are being followed, the incidences of COTI, catheter-related urinary tract infections following urine catheterizations, be it in the emergency, in the ward, or in the ICU, is less if this hand hygiene is followed and aseptic precautions are followed. In our hospital over the last 10 years, we have noted that you know, when we analyze the causes of catheter-associated urinary tract infections, we hardly find that you know, the insertion bundle is at fault. It is mostly the maintenance which is the we suspect it to be at fault, but catheterization insertion practices have really improved over a period of time in our hospital. So now coming to the later part of the catheterization process, where the catheter is connected to a closed sterile drainage bag. It has to be a closed sterile drainage bag. If there is a pre-existing UTI is thought to be possible, a specimen of urine is sent for routine microscopy and then culture. Routine microscopy, if the pus cells is coming more than 8 to 10, then that can be sent for culture. Or if there is a very high suspicion of an UTI, it can be right away sent for culture also. And the drainage bag is usually positioned below the level of the bladder to facilitate drainage. And we have to follow a daily review of the need for the urinary catheter on a daily basis. Actually, it's a very important step, and it is best done by the nurses and I feel the junior doctors in the unit. We have to see on a daily basis, like if a patient is, you know, good enough to pass urine on his own, and if the catheter can be removed as soon as possible. because catheters are not a benign interventions and infections are always cited as the most common healthcare associated infections, but nevertheless other issues also like pain, like many times patient complains of pain or discomfort at the meatus. There could be mechanical issues like blockage and it causes urinary bladder retentions, right? And even if there is mucosal injury subsequently in the long term, patient also can develop calculi. So this is a, I'm sharing with you as a maintenance bundle checklist from our hospital where patient details, temperatures at different times of the day, at least 6 times intervals it is recorded. Hand hygiene practices, perineal or meatal care done, catheter secured to the thigh. It is very important again because if the catheter is not secured to the thigh and if it is loose, during the patient movement, if the patient is mobile, it causes traction on the meatus and thereby it causes injury, facilitating entrance of the colonizing bacteria in that area. So catheter, if you're securing it to the thigh with a tape on the thigh, avoiding obviously the hairy parts, it causes, if uh, there is some space for the catheter to be loose. So it does not cause traction on the meatus. And always the system should be closed. So it does not allow entrance of organisms from the proximity vicinity. Urine bag should be below the level of the bladder. This is very important. And urine collected as a separate procedure. The person who collects urine just is open it from the bottom. There's a um, entrance there. There's a point there from where it opens and collects the urine separately. And the necessity of the catheter is reviewed frequently. And this has to be done on a daily basis. So this is the checklist that we're talking about. This is a picture showing the traction on the catheter. It is not stuck to the thigh, and there is some, you can see some purulent urine here, indicative of a urinary tract infections already there. Or it could be blockage also, because the patient's thigh is also pressing on the catheter. This is just an example of a catheter COTI or catheter associated urinary tract infection. This is for a patient who was admitted with polytrauma and fractured right femur. He, on admission, Collies was inserted, and then around 15 days later, he had high TLC, leukocytosis. There was fever, and urine culture was sent, which grew E. coli. So that is almost 14th day post catheterizations. This is to be termed as COTI, one of the commonest nosocomial infections. Blood culture did not show any growth. Wound was also didn't show any growth. The patient was discharged after 2 months because the culture had, the infection had to be treated, and obviously the bill had skyrocketed because of the antibiotics, mainly if it is due to a multi-drug resistant organisms. So the reminder to the care providers are the patient if has an indwelling urinary catheter since how many days. This is kind of checklist actually. How long the catheter has been in place, and you have to indicate that the catheter should be removed or not, and if it has to be discontinued, that instruction also has to be given. And if the catheter is to be continued, we have to provide one of the reasons regarding why the catheter is needed for that patient. This can be mentioned in a checklist or it can be documented in the patient file. So ventilator associated pneumonia, what is the definition? Definition is, I think there is some, for a patient who has been on ventilator, patient developing new infections after 48 hours of the hospital admission or after being put on the ventilator. If he's developing a pneumonia, this is usually termed as ventilator associated pneumonia. There's some defect in the slides, so it's not showing up. So now we'll basically focus on the VAP care bundle. This encompasses the following points. Elevation of the head end of the bed to 30 to 45 degrees. So the patients who are in ICU and who are on ventilator, the head end of the bed has to be always elevated, minimum 30 degrees and optimally 45 degrees. Now what happens is, like many patients who are either sedated or non-sedated, they tend to slide down the bed. So most of the patients, when if they are they slide down the bed, they will be lying supine on the bed, and thereby the secretions either from the mouth, they tend to go down in the respiratory tract. There will be peritubal leak and they slide down to the lungs, causing aspiration, microaspiration of the oral secretions, and cause or facilitate development of ventilator-associated pneumonias. The second point is about daily sedative interruptions and daily assessment of readiness to extubate. So if you think like the ventilator is the cause, so we need to assess on a daily basis to understand if the ventilator could be weaned off and patient if could be extubated or not. Peptic ulcer disease prophylaxis. Now, how this peptic ulcer disease prophylaxis helps prevent ventilator-associated pneumonia? Because we know that in the gut, there are many bacteria are there, and especially when there is an nasogastric tube, there is an endotracheal tube, the oropharynx and the upper respiratory tract, there is some breach in the mucosal integrity due to this invasive pipes, right? So, and that would tends to be overgrowth of the gut flora. So, if you are giving this peptic ulcer prophylaxis, it prevents development of the ulcers, as well as also if you're overdoing the peptic ulcer prophylaxis, there occurs overgrowth of the other harmful bacteria, which can actually, ascend up in the oropharynx, and during the process of micro aspiration, they can go to the lungs and cause pneumonia there. Deep venous thrombosis prophylaxis should be instituted in all patients who are on ventilator because they are at high risk of deep vein thrombosis if there is no contraindications for so. Of all, I think the oral care, I believe in my practice, I have found that it is very, very important because patients, when they accumulate their daily secretions in the mouth, either due to the salivary secretions or from the regurgitations, it stays, if you are not cleaning the mouth properly, they tend to remain behind the crevices in behind the gum. And what happens is due to higher use of antibiotics or due to their prolonged stay in the ICU per se, they tend to have or these secretions get affected by the multi-drug resistant organisms. Mostly the Klebsiellas, the Pseudomonas, and the Acinetobacter, or even E. coli at times also becomes flora of the or get amalgamated with this oral secretions. And when you are microaspirating these secretions, they tend to go to the lungs and give rise to ventilator associated with the hospital acquired pneumonias. So daily thorough oral care at least twice a day is extremely important for patients, and it definitely does reduces the incidence of ventilator associated pneumonia. In our ICU, I would say first from 2011 when I joined, for the first 4 to 5 years, we used to have cases of VAT every alternate month. But over the months, then we started did a audit and we realized that the oral care is not optimum. And most likely this we pinpointed that due to this lack of oral care, probably our incidences are not coming down. And then we started emphasizing on this oral care. Multiple sessions were conducted for nurses and junior doctors to ensure that oral care is at least given the very thoroughly, at least in the morning shift and in the evening, at least twice daily. And thereafter, in the last 3 years, our VAP incidences has remained far below the world benchmark. So, in my experience, I think oral care has got very important role in preventing ventilator-associated pneumonias, and followed by the elevation of the head end of the bed. This is an example of a case who was got a traumatic brain injury after a road traffic accident. This is an old case. Patient who was admitted and ventilated because of the low GCS. He was on ventilator. So on admission, his chest was clear. All the cultures were negative. Tracheostomy was done. He was on ventilator. And then you see after almost 6 to 8 days, he had spiked fever. And TLC count was normal. X-ray had right basal pneumonia. There was profuse secretions. And the secretions grew Klebsiella pneumonia. So this is something like, see, the patient was admitted on 6th and had a temperature on 14th. So after 8 days, so more than 48 hours of ventilator support, it qualifies under the definition as a ventilator associated pneumonia. And usually if it is more than 4 days after the ventilator is attached, it is known as late VAP. That is late ventilator associated pneumonia. If it is more than before the 4 days, it is termed as early ventilator associated pneumonias. So care bundle checklist, this is a kind of summative sheet of checklist for VAB bundle and the COTI bundle. These two aspects, these 2 points we have discussed so far. So for the VAB, again, hand hygiene is common to all care bundles. You can see the head end of the patient to be raised to 30 to 45 degrees. Peptic ulcer prophylaxis and DVD prophylaxis, sedation, vacation, and early extubation. Mouth care with chlorhexidine is, I think, is the most important one, and it should actually come at the top. Aseptic suctions before positioning change. Whenever you are disconnecting the ventilator for suctioning, you have to wear sterile gloves, and that should be at least 2 persons to do the tracheal suctioning. Otherwise, because the person who is disconnecting and using the catheter, the hands should be separate. Otherwise, if the same person is doing both detachment and suctioning and attaching, it gets contaminated. So at least 2 persons are required for tracheal or endotracheal tube suctioning. And mobility and chest physiotherapy is again important for draining the secretions and for pulmonary rehabilitations. So regarding COTI bundle, again, as I said, hand hygiene is very common. Routine hygiene of the meatal areas. The catheter has to be secured on the thigh without kinking. Urine bag should be below the bladder level. Should be collected by a separate container. There should be a separate opening from which the urine has to be collected. Necessity of the indwelling catheter has to be reviewed on a daily basis, and it is usually signed by all the 3 staffs. We come to the CBSI bundle when you discuss this. So regarding peripherous venous catheter bundles, it is almost similar for peripheral and central venous catheters. We only use a peripherous venous catheter if it is necessary to do so. You need to have the consent of the patient when the patient is especially conscious and awake, and perform a hand hygiene before collecting the sundries, like the attachments and the flush syringe, the stickers. All this has to be collected before. Wear gloves and use alcohol wipes to clean the insertion site very well. If possible, use only a peripherous venous cannula where the vein can be seen clearly. Otherwise, if you just are not sure of a vein and you keep on pricking in the hope that you will get some blood, then you end up creating multiple puncture sites, and it becomes actually predisposed to developing some bacterial infections from either the staph or the staphylococcus, where the normal residential on the skin. So the particular vein has to be clearly visible before you are attempting to insert the cannula. You have to make sure that the insertion site is covered with an intact sterile IV designated dressing. The dressing has to be proper. And before dressing, again, you need to see that that area is not hairy. If there is, a lot of hairs and you're putting a dressing on that, it becomes very painful for the patient when you're removing it. And during the process also, it is quite painful for the patient if area is hairy. And remove gloves and perform hand hygiene again. So hand hygiene before collecting the sundries, it is again emphasized because that is the thing which you're inserting into the vein, and you're dressing that site. So hand hygiene is the most important step. Use alcohol swipe to clean the insertion site. Again, review and document daily the continuing need of the line. Remove this line as soon as the patient's clinical condition mandates so, or if there is insertion site swelling or extravasation, or if there any discharge. If it has been in place for more than 3 days, then consider changing the cannula. If you have good alternative, sorry. On daily basis, please check with the patient to report if there is pain or inflammation, swelling or discharge or leakage, which would be visible. If unnoticed and not taken care, this kind of devastating results can happen. You can see there's inflammation, it's almost necrosis of this area going up to till the thumb, and almost necrosis of the thumb. The patient may recover from the primary illness or for which the patient might have come. Patients with multi-organ failure, septic shock, and even more serious diseases would have recovered from the primary illness, but they develop this kind of complications, and these are the residual morbidity that they, when they leave the hospital, they are burdened with. So you have to prevent this complications, and this is a purely hospital-acquired nosocomial infection and complication thereof. This is a cannula when there is backflow of blood and it is not clean. So it becomes a very good medium for the bacteria to grow and causes inflammation afterwards. All jewelries from the patients should be removed, like these rings, or if the lady patients are wearing bangles, or if there is necklaces, these things should be removed. Number one, because this could be colonized with bacteria, and we are actually not cleaning this, and this when into cannula near is nearby. So the colonized organism from this ring actually can migrate and infect the insertion site. And number two, if there is inflammation and swelling of the limb afterwards, this ring will get stuck. So this extraneous jewelry must be removed for all patients who are admitted to ICU. For ladies, if they are very emotional about this bangles and all that, we can inform the family, whoever the next of kin, remove the bangles and put them, clean them and put them in a gauze piece, and you can attach to one of the body, on the hands or keep by the bedside. But they need not keep it wearing, because if you're having the bangles and you're and the venflons on the same hand, it becomes a risk factor of infection of the insertion site, be it the venous line or if you're doing the arterial lines. So this is our daily statistic thrombophlebitis or infiltration chart again. The chart system or the checklist system actually makes things very easier to follow up with the nurses and to teach them and to keep a track of the patient's conditions, any infections. On a daily basis, this is charted, medication, IV fluids, and if any complication has happened, to see the actions taken or the remarks. Now, what is this Clostridium difficile care bundle? All such patients, once they are come with a report of Clostridium difficile, is one of the bacteria which is responsible for antibiotic associated diarrheas. Now, most of the patients who are in ICU, or if they're getting long term antibiotics, most of them develop antibiotic associated diarrheas. What we do is normally we still send the stool sample for Clostridial difficile toxins. There are two types of toxins, toxin A and toxin B, and it can be also sent for GI, that GI panel. So if the report comes positive for Clostridium difficile, these patients are needed to be isolated in a single room with clinical hand washing skin or a designated toilet until they are at least 48 hours symptom free, because this infection actually can spread to the adjacent patients and to the areas. That is why these patients are need to be strictly isolated. And if they are on any antibiotic regimen, the inappropriate antibiotics have to be immediately stopped. We want to make sure that the whole healthcare workers remove their PPEs, mostly the gloves and the aprons, immediately after each contact with such patients and their environment. Because this bacteria exists in the stool samples, and if you have been in contact with these patients, they may be residing on the adjacent vicinity, like on the linens or the bed rails, and they might have touched your clothes. So if you're using your PPEs, you have to make sure that you're disposing those PPEs safely and away from other patients, so as to prevent further spread of that bacteria to other patients and in the unit. And make sure that hand hygiene is performed with liquid soap and water immediately after removal of the PPE. Need to check that the patient's immediate environment and all patient care equipment has been thoroughly cleaned with a neutral detergent and disinfected with a sporocidal disinfectant. Because this Clostridial difficile has got spores and they are quite resistant, the bacteria may die, but the spores, if they're there on the surface, they take longer time. So we have to make sure that they're disinfected with a sporocidal disinfectant. So I would say for the Clostridium difficile infections, the infection control team particularly has to, issue a caution, and they have to, because the incidences are not very high, fortunately. But if such a specimen is or infection positive report comes, the infection control nurse must go there and notify and teach the staff about the specific steps to be taken, because this is slightly different from other care bundles, and about this cleaning protocol of a neutral detergent and disinfection with a sporicidal disinfectant also needs to be discussed. This is again another checklist for the central venous insertion checklist. This I remember we devised in 2012. After when I joined in 2011, we are actually having many issues or discrepancy in placement of the central line catheter by various team members. So we discussed about, for making a checklist for this. And I would say very good results have been obtained. And our CRBC rates have been zero for almost many months. In the last 5 years, it has been well below the world benchmark. So it is very good idea to have checklist actually care models, because humanistically it is not possible for every caregiver like the nurse, technician, or junior doctors, or even for senior doctors to remember all the steps. But if we have a checklist kind of things, when one person is performing the task, the other person can just stand and check the checklist. Thereby, the uniformity of the practices are very easily established, and results are really excellent. So, what about this CRBSI prevention bundle? You have to merely see that if it is necessary or not. Use an insertion checklist. As I just mentioned, surgical scrub technique has to be good. The surgeon, the doctor, whoever is going to perform the line has to thoroughly scrub himself or herself or the surgical scrub. And maximum barrier precautions have to be taken using a cap, sterile gown, sterile gloves, and mask. We do follow all this. Many times you will not be surprised if you see, like, doctors will be just wearing an apron and they'll be putting on the sterile gloves and put a, sterile gown over the or sheet over the patient and trying to do the lines. That is absolutely something which needs to be discouraged, because if a patient is developing a CRBSI, central and related bloodstream infections, the consequences are enormous in terms of length of stay, sepsis, further antibiotics, and the cost and the complications of other antibiotics also. Because if you're using the antibiotic, you're forced to use antibiotics for another CRBSI, the length is a minimum 5 to 7 days, and due to that higher antibiotics, again the patient develops some other MDR, multi-drug resistant infection, also predisposed to fungal infection. So I think it is prevention is better than cure. So this technique has to be very strictly and religiously followed. We have completely stopped allowing, we never allow anybody putting a line without completely scrubbing up and using this barrier, or if they're not using this barrier precautions. So whoever is performing this procedure of central line has to wear a cap, sterile gown, sterile gloves, and mask, and this gives excellent results. Using aseptic techniques throughout the procedure, and we have to select the site also, proper site. For many different patients, the site chosen has to be different. For a patient who is on a ventilator, ARDS patient, nowadays you have most of these COVID patients on ventilator who are on high ventilator settings and high PEEP. It is difficult to do a central line in the neck or at the jugular site because of the fear of pneumothorax. So for these patients, actually, we do advocate to do a femoral central line when the patient is quite acutely ill and high level of ventilator settings. With a good care, actually, you can maintain a femoral venous catheter maximum for 7 to 10 days. But thereafter, I think femoral central line needs to be changed because it is close to the genital and anal area where you have to cleaning the for stool, etc. So there is chances of contaminations. But other times, it is best to do the necklines or subclavian lines because the infection incidences are less if it is properly handled. 2% chlorhexidine gluconate in alcohol for skin antisepsis are recommended for before insertions. As I said, femoral vein is not normally preferred, but under the circumstances, if your patient is only on higher ventilator or if it has been previously tried, then you got to choose the femoral vein site. Sterile film dressing or dry gauze and daily assess as soon as the line can be removed. For patients who get cured and they are shifted from ICU to ward, it is better to remove the central line in the ICUs because what nurses again, they have to look after 8 to 10 patients, one nurse. So giving the central line care is not possible. Handling is not always the best or ideal. So better to remove the central line as possible and do a peripheral cannula for patients who are going to ICUs, out of ICU to ward. So maintenance bundle, checking hand hygiene before and after. Whenever you're giving antibiotics, if you're removing the stopcock and giving the injections, thereafter you have to clean before giving the injections and afterwards also. Ensuring that the dressing is intact and at least changed once in 7 days. I mentioned about that alcohol CBC hub decontamination is performed before each hub access. If you do not have those alcohol wipes also, you can just take a cotton or a small gauze, put some chlorhexidine over it, clean it and give the injections. And while closing also, you can clean it as well. Protecting the line integrity. If it is again blocked, the chances of infections are high. Daily review of the necessity. Screen the patients for the site infection as well. So this is a typical internal jugular line. You can see a sterile, transparent dressing. The site is clean and the date of insertion is maintained. Date of dressing. So insertion was on 26th 7th and the dressing is on the next day. On a daily basis, the dressing is changed, but if it is not soiled, you can keep it for up to 3 days. And these 3 lumens of the central line ideally should be covered in a sterile small sheet or gloves, which is there. There you can see a green sheet over here. It should not be just left, on the bed sheet, because the patient's hair and this nasogastric tube, if all they get intermingled, it is difficult to remain clean, and then infections might just penetrate. So you can put a cap on the patient's hairs so that the hair get covered and they are not mingling with the central line lumens. Similarly, this nasogastric tube should not be interpassing through or crossing the central line. It should be separate over the head and not crossing any other invasive lines. And all these junctures should be where this 3 ways are connected, it should be tight. This is example of a patient who was in ICU, central line done, and was shifted to the ward in a stable condition on 19th, and after 4 days shifted from ward to ICU in critical condition because the patient had developed septic shock with sepsis. 11,000, BP was low, blood culture and central line tip culture was sent, which grew Candida species. So within, I think, 11 days, in a short span, patient developed septic shock, and both the blood culture and the central line tip culture is growing Candida. It is branded as a central line related bloodstream infections, mostly due to, this could be due to the maintenance bundle. It has always impact on the cost. Surgical site infection prevention bundles are similar. Nowadays, it is a big change actually in the last, I would say 4 to 5 years. We hear that earlier all the sites used to be raised, used to be, shaved off. Now it is just called that to avoid, best to avoid hair removal. If the hair removal is necessary, avoid the use of razors. And ensure prophylactic antibiotic was prescribed as per the local antibiotic policy. Sign the guideline for the specific operation category. Ensure that the antibiotic is given within 60 minutes or 1 hour prior to the operation. Ensure that the patient's body temperature is normal throughout the surgery. Ensure that the patient's blood glucose level was normal throughout the operation. This is for the best surgical outcomes. Normothermia, except for cardiac surgery, because cardiac surgery we institute hypothermia for the cardiac bypass. And patients are preoperatively, they could be screened according to the local flora for Staph aureus or MRSA, and if positive, they need to be decolonized before taken off for surgeries. So a patient who is being taken off for surgery, it is good or desirable to have normal blood sugar or well-controlled blood sugar if a patient is diabetic. Number 2, they should not have any other active infections going on, like urinary tract infections or chest infections or any other infection in the site. Many times we see that patients, unless it is an emergency surgery, only emergency surgeries, all these bundles or this checklist can be bypassed. But for all elective surgeries, this should be followed. One of the examples of this body temperature I would share that for a patient, suppose we had a head injury patient who came from the operation theater and he had continued to have high fever. Now, high fever is possible in head injury patients without infection also. This could be due to the bleeding inside the brain. So we have to differentiate that if this patient is actually having an infection and fever or it is an non-infective fever. So those cases you can take help of this biomarkers to differentiate between the causes of fever. But if the patient has got active urinary tract infections or active sepsis, then doing a tracheostomy on this case in these cases is not advisable. We can wait for the infection to settle and then go for a tracheostomy. Otherwise, this patient also becomes susceptible for soft tissue infections, and many times there could be an infection of the tracheal stoma. So if there is active body temperature or active infections, it is better to avoid elective surgeries. Sepsis care bundles are similar because in resuscitation, I think it is not part of this discussion, but I'll just emphasize about giving the antibiotics within 1 hour and collecting the blood culture and sending it before giving the antibiotics most appropriately. This is the old one. Now it is within 1 hour actually. So cultures for infection care control practices, there has to be leaders. There has to be leader in the hospital. It could be the administrator, or could most like commonly it is the physicians and the critical care physicians, or doctors in the ward or other clinical specialists in the ward. Staff should understand their accountability, and staff should speak up about risk without fear. One of the commonest examples I would always like to quote is about, suppose other different specialties in ICUs come to visit their patients, and when the team of other specialists they enter the ICUs, most of them, some do and some do not wash their hands by habit. And many times, if it is a doctor, like who is straightly going to the patient, they just enter and how are you, patient, and how is the patient system? They ask and straight go to the patient and start touching the patient, to check their GCS or just to check their well-being. I think the nurse must speak to this kind of doctors or other team members and ask them to wash their hands. Now we have many incidences where the senior doctors or even the junior doctors also would take it as an ego issue, and they tend to have abusive behavior or aggressive behavior to the staff. This is something which it's our responsibility as the in charges of ICUs or other hospital administrator to see that every staff must be empowered to speak up and to you point to others for compliance with the hospital infection control practices. Because if you see all the care bundles, the most and foremost important step is hand hygiene. And if you're not washing your hands and touching the patient like this, the first, most important and the basic cause is forfeited. So every staff must be empowered, and then they only able to speak up about the risk without fear. Yes, observe, coach, and hold another accountable for safety. Many times during rounds, actually, we also get pointed out that, Madam, you need to wash your hands. And we do appreciate it because we human beings, while we talk and, it's sometimes, diverted mentally, and we just forget to wash your hands. So if somebody is pointing out about hand washing, that is something very well much should be welcome. Critical thinking skills is always appreciated, and staff should proactively engage patients and families in their healthcare. The waste disposal is another integral part of infection control practices, because you know about this different colored beans, this yellow, blue, and the black one. So all those I'll not discuss what should to be put in what. I think most of us know that, but this has to be done properly. Mostly nowadays in the era of COVID, this has to be more strictly followed, and dunning and duffing practices are also, mostly the duffing practices are highly emphasized, because this is the time or the part of the day where cross infection of COVID infection to staffs is mostly happening. So doffing time or the doffing area has to be thoroughly cleaned, and all the steps of doffing has to be religiously followed. Curtains are not useful to prevent infections. They are mostly used for privacy reasons. Ensure privacy, and time to time you have to audit or check the staff's healthcare practitioners for their fingers or their colonizers, like many in the OT, frequently for the nasal cavity of the surgeons or other staffs. Even fingerprints of the doctors or nurses or technicians are tested for this, and it shows it is a blood agar plate which is showing growth of staphylococcus or streptococcus. Finds 5 steps of hand wash. It cannot be overemphasized. This is, I would say, the most important step for preventing all kinds of hospital acquired infections, all the 5 kind of infections that we talked about. And nowadays in COVID times, this is again the whole thing which is being practiced and advised for each and every household. So this is nothing something new, but I think it has not only confined to the hospital, now it has also come to our household. Before and after touching, before and after procedure, after body fluid exposure, after touching a patient, after touching the patient's surroundings. Regarding the body fluid, I would say, like many times I have seen staffs, like suppose when they are extubating patients or they're giving feed to the nasogastric tube, feed to the patients, they tend to just do it with the bare hand. They wash their hands, but they do not use gloves. And if you're giving the feed, holding the nasogastric tube up, many times patients cough, and that secretions also tend to spill all over, and the patient, if the staff is barehanded, it also tends to stick to their hands. It is always advisable to use sterile gloves or disposable gloves at least before touching this tubes and pipes in the body, because there could be inadvertent occasions where the body fluid might spill onto the caregiver. So hand hygiene and hand hygiene and hand hygiene, that's how we have actually, this is our team, I would say, with whom actually we've been able to achieve our goals, and we have been able to keep our rates of hospital-acquired infections, mostly the VAP, CRBSI, soft tissue infections, below the benchmark for the last 5 years. COTI is, of course, a difficult one to handle and is still troubling us off and on. But we have able to achieve that insertion bundle. We have made it sure that it is uniformly practiced. It is a maintenance bundle. Most of the times during analysis we find which is at fault, and we are working on it by constant teaching and training. So what are the challenges in the practical life you face is about this following this infection control practices. Most and foremost important one is this uses of antibiotics. Now antibiotics, I would say, it is mostly comes from the pen of the consultants, be it surgeons or physicians. And this antimicrobial stewardship is necessary to make sure that happens judicious use of antibiotics. Now it is very easily said than done, because most of the hospitals or healthcare centers across the globe, we find there are issues in this aspect of antibiotic. That is the judicious use of antibiotics, and it is the sole factor which is responsible for emergence of multi-drug resistant organisms. So this antimicrobial stewardship actually has to be a combined campaign by the infection control team, the clinicians, and the administrators. And this, along with the infection control practices of hand hygiene and other steps that we discussed, can achieve least infection, at least in the hospitals. We have to empower nurses and the infection control team, and the examples that we discussed are actually real, and this only will come from empowerment of the nurses and the team members of the infection control. Administrative proactiveness is highly desirable. Implementation should be, no matter how many sessions of teaching and training happens, how many discussions or meeting happens or documentation happen, it is at the end of the day the implementation has to be done. Compliance has to be there to get results. So the formula to that is regular audit and action taken reports to be discussed at regular intervals in the monthly or quarterly infection control meetings. Thank you very much for patient listening.